In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a farmer's barn burns to ashes, and his body is found inside murdered. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp mind and gentle smile, unravels a web of secrets, a bitter neighbour's feud, a widow's hidden grief, a loyal hired hand's dark loyalty, and a slick insurance agent's deadly fraud. As clues like a charred pen and a suspicious cloth emerge, only one truth will rise from the ashes. Who killed Farmer Giles, and why? Dive into the burned barn, a chilling mystery where no one is what they seem. Chapter 1. The smouldering ruin. The village of St. Mary Mead lay hushed under a pale October sky, its cottages and hedgerows bathed in the soft, misty light of early morning. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlour window, her fingers deftly working, the needles of her knitting, a delicate shawl of pale blue wool taking shape in her lap. The rhythm of her craft was as steady as her thoughts, which often wandered to the small dramas of village life. But this morning the air carried an acrid tang, a faint whiff of smoke that made her pause, her sharp eyes lifting from her work to the world beyond her lace curtains. The door burst open, and Janet, her young maid, entered with a tray of tea, her face flushed with excitement. "Oh, ma'am, it's dreadful," she exclaimed, setting the tray down with a clatter. "Farmer Giles Barnett's burned to the ground, and they found him dead inside. Burned to cinders, they say, though some whisper it's no accident." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial hush, as if the walls might carry the tale to the wrong ears. Miss Marple's needles stilled entirely, resting in her lap like a pair of crossed swords. "Dead, you say?" she murmured, her tone mild but her mind already turning, sifting through the implications. "And the barn destroyed. Tell me, Janet, what are they saying in the village?" Janet, eager to share, leaned forward. "Mrs. Price at the bakery says she saw smoke rising before dawn. And young Tommy, the butcher's boy, swears he heard a shout from that way last night. Constable Harrow's up there now, poking about the ashes. They're saying it might be murder, ma'am." Her eyes widened, relishing the scandal. "Murder," Miss Marple repeated softly, her gaze drifting to the window. The word hung in the air, heavy with possibility. She knew St. Mary Mead too well to dismiss such whispers. Beneath its quaint surface, the village harboured passions and grievances as fierce as any city's. Farmer Giles, a gruff man with a temper, had not been universally loved. His disputes with neighbours, his sharp words to his hired hand, and his recent dealings with an insurance agent, these flickered through her mind like entries in a ledger. "Thank you, Janet," Miss Marple said, rising with a that belied her years. "I think I shall take a walk to see this for myself. Fetch my coat and hat, will you?" Janet scurried off, and Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her thoughts already weaving a pattern from the threads of gossip and fact. A burned barn, a dead man, and whispers of foul play, these were no mere accidents of fate. She felt the familiar stir of curiosity, a quiet thrill that sharpened her senses. The path to Giles' farm was a familiar one, winding past the church and over a stile to the fields beyond. As she approached, the air grew thick with the stench of charred wood and something darker, a grim reminder of mortality. The barn, once a sturdy structure of weathered oak, was now a blackened ruin, its roof collapsed into a heap of smouldering beams. A small crowd had gathered, villagers drawn by morbid fascination, their murmurs a low hum against the crackle of dying embers. Constable Harrow stood near the wreckage, his notebook in hand, his broad face creased with the weight of his task. Miss Marple lingered at the edge of the group, her unassuming figure in its sensible tweed coat and neat hat blending with the onlookers. She observed the scene with a practiced eye, noting the four figures who stood apart, their faces marked by varying degrees of shock, guilt, or calculation. There was Tom Bradley, the neighbor, his weathered face set in a scowl, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his worn jacket. Ellen Giles, the farmer's wife, stood pale and silent, her eyes fixed on the ground as if it might yield answers. Jed Harper, the hired hand, shifted restlessly, his wiry frame taut with unspent energy. And Mr. Vernon Lyle, the insurance agent, seemed an outsider in his polished suit. His expression one of practiced concern, Constable Harrow called out questions. His voice gruff but uncertain, as if he sensed the truth was slippery. "When did you last see Giles?" he asked Bradley, who muttered something about mending fences the previous evening. Ellen's reply was softer, barely audible, claiming she'd been asleep when the fire started. Jed insisted he'd been in his bunk at the farm's edge, and Lyle, with a smooth smile, said he'd been in town, miles away. Miss Marple listened, her eyes moving from one to another, catching the flicker of unease in Lyle's gaze, the tremor in Ellen's hands, the clench of Yet's jaw, and the sullen defiance in Bradley's stance. She stepped closer to the ruins, her boots crunching on the ash-strewn grass. The barn's skeleton loomed stark against the sky, its destruction deliberate, she thought. Fires did not burn so thoroughly without aid, and men like Giles did not die by chance. Her mind turned to motives: Bradley's feud over a strip of land, Ellen's rumored discontent in her marriage, Jet's loyalty strained by meager wages, and Lyle's involvement with a policy that might hide more than it promised. Each suspect was a piece in a puzzle, and Miss Marple knew that puzzles, however complex, always yielded to patient scrutiny. As she turned to leave, the wind carried a faint scent of kerosene, sharp and telling. She filed it away, along with the image of Bradley's mud-caked boots and Lyle's too perfect composure. "A sad business," she murmured to Mrs. Price, who hovered nearby, eager for details. But Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere already, tracing the threads of this dark affair. She would return to her parlour, to her tea and her knitting, but her mind would not rest. The smouldering ruin of Giles' barn held secrets, and she was determined to unravel them. Chapter 2. The Four Suspects. Morning sun had barely climbed above the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead when Miss Jane Marple made her way back from the smouldering ruins of Farmer Giles' barn. Her steps were measured, her sensible shoes crunching softly on the gravel path, but her mind was far from idle. The acrid scent of charred wood lingered in her nostrils, and the image of the blackened timbers, jagged against the pale sky, was fixed in her thoughts. More vivid still were the faces of the four individuals she had observed at the sea, and Tom Bradley, Ellen Giles, Jed Harper, and Vernon Lyle. Each had stood apart, their expressions a canvas of emotions that hinted at secrets yet to be uncovered. Miss Marple knew that murder, if murder it was never a solitary act. It was a knot of motives and opportunities, and she intended to untangle it. The village was stirring now, its usual rhythm disrupted by the grim news. From her vantage point on the path, Miss Marple could see the postmistress, Miss Weatherby, peering from her window, and the baker's wife, Mrs. Price, gossiping with a knot of women outside the shop. Their voices carried faintly, a hum of speculation that would only grow as the day wore on. Miss Marple did not pause to join them. Gossip, she knew, was a tool to be wielded carefully, sifted for truth amid exaggeration. Instead, she turned. toward the field where Constable Harrow was still at work. His broad figure, moving among the ashes like a reluctant gardener tending a blighted plot. The constable had roped off the barn's remains, a futile gesture given the villagers' curiosity, but it gave him an air of authority. Miss Marple approached quietly, her unassuming presence allowing her to slip past the onlookers without drawing attention. She wore her tweed coat and a hat pinned neatly with a brooch, her appearance as unremarkable as a sparrow, yet her eyes missed nothing. Harrow was questioning the 4 suspects again, his notebook open, his pencil stubs scratching notes with a dogged persistence. Miss Marple positioned herself near a crumbling stone wall, half hidden by a tangle of ivy, and listened. Tom Bradley stood first, his burly frame tense, his weathered face set in a scowl that seemed permanent. His jacket was patched at the elbows, and his boots, caked with mud and something darker, bore the marks of the field's hand. Perhaps the fire. "I told you, Harrow," he growled, his voice rough as the gravel underfoot. "I was mending my fences last night, down by the brook, nowhere near Giles' place. You think I'd risk my own land with a fire like that?" His tone was defiant, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked toward the barn's ruins, as if searching for something or fearing it might be found. Harrow's pencil paused. "You and Giles had words, didn't you? Over that strip of land by the copse. Folks say you threatened him more than once." The constable's voice was steady, but there was a hint of uncertainty, as if he sensed Bradley's temper might outstrip his patience. "Words ain't murder," Bradley snapped, his fists clenching. "Giles was a cheat, claiming my acre as his own, but I didn't kill him. I was home by dusk, asked my wife." His gaze darted to the side, where Ellen Giles stood, and Miss Marple caught a flicker of something anger, perhaps, or guilt in his expression before he turned away. Ellen Giles was next, her slight figure wrapped in a shawl that seemed too large for her. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, but dry, as if she had exhausted her tears in private. She held herself with a quiet dignity, her hands clasped tightly before her, the knuckles white. "I was asleep when it happened," she said, her voice low and steady, though it carried the weight of grief. "Mr. Giles went to check the barn after supper. He said he heard a noise. I didn't think anything of it until I awoke to the smell of smoke." Her words were measured, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her fingers, the way her gaze lingered on the ground rather than meeting Harrow's eyes. "You didn't go with him?" Harrow asked, his tone gentle but probing. "A noise like that, late at night, most wives would check." Ellen's lips tightened. "John didn't like me meddling in his work. He said the barn was his business." She hesitated, then added, "He'd been worried lately about money. Said the barn was insured, but I didn't know the details." Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple's keen ears caught the unspoken question. Had that insurance been a motive? For someone else? Jed Harper, the hired hand, was a contrast to Ellen's stillness. He was a wiry man, no more than 30, with a restless energy that made him shift from foot to foot as Harrow questioned him. His hands, rough with calluses, toyed with the brim of his cap, and a fresh burn mark on his wrist caught Miss Marple's eye, half hidden by his frayed sleeve. "I was in my bunk," Jed said, his voice sharp with defiance. "Out by the old shed, a good ways from the barn. Slept through it all till the shouting woke me. By then, the fire was roaring." His eyes flicked to Ellen, a fleeting look of concern, before returning to Harrow. "You didn't see anything, hear anything before the shouting?" Harrow pressed, his pencil poised. You live on the farm, Harper. Hard to believe you missed it all. Jed's jaw tightened. I work hard, Constable. I sleep hard too. Giles wasn't one to pay for idle hands, so I don't go poking about at night. His tone was bitter, and Miss Marple wondered at the edge in it. Giles had not been an easy employer, that much was clear, but was yet's resentment deep enough to spark violence? Last was Vernon Lyle, the insurance agent, whose polished appearance stood out starkly against the rural scene. His suit was immaculate, his shoes gleaming despite the ash-strewn ground, and his smile was as smooth as his voice. I was in town, Constable, he said, his tone almost too affable, at the Red Lion, having a late supper with a client. I didn't hear about the fire until this morning. A terrible loss, of course. Poor Giles. His words dripped with sympathy, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened on his briefcase, the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow despite the cool air. Harrow frowned, flipping through his notebook. You were here 2 days ago, Mr. Lyle, talking to Giles about his policy. Any reason you didn't mention that? Lyle's smile didn't waver, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Routine business, Constable. Giles wanted to review his coverage. Given the value of that barn, I advised him, as always. Nothing unusual. He spread his hands, the gesture practiced. But Miss Marple caught the brief glance he cast toward the ruins, as if calculating what remained. Harrow grunted, clearly unsatisfied but lacking the sharpness to press further. He dismissed them with a wave, turning to confer with a young officer who had arrived with a camera. The suspects dispersed, Bradley stalking off toward his fields. Ellen moving slowly toward the farmhouse, Jed lingering as if reluctant to leave her, and Lyle striding briskly toward his car, parked incongruously at the lane's end. Miss Marple watched them go, her mind cataloguing their words, their gestures, their lies. She stepped closer to the barn's edge, where the ashes were thickest, and bent to examine the ground. The soil was churned, not just by the fire brigades, boots, but by earlier tracks, now blurred by heat and water. A faint gleam caught her ajar shard of glass, half buried in the ash, its edge melted smooth. She did not touch it, knowing Harrow's men would overlook such details, but she noted its position near a charred beam. Kerosene, she thought, recalling the sharp scent from earlier. A fire like this needed fuel, and glass suggested a bottle, perhaps broken in haste. As she straightened, Mrs. Price approached, her round face alight with curiosity. Terrible, isn't it, Miss Marple, she said, her voice a mix of sympathy and relish. They say Giles was struck before the fire took him. Murder, plain as day. Who'd do such a thing? Her eyes darted to the retreating figures, hungry. For a hint of scandal, Miss Marple smiled faintly, her expression one of gentle concern. A sad business, Mrs. Price, but people will talk, won't they? Best not to jump to conclusions. Her tone was mild, but her mind was far from idle. Bradley's feud was no secret. The village had buzzed for years about his claim to that disputed acre. Ellen's quiet grief masked something deeper, fear, perhaps, or knowledge she dared not share. Jed's loyalty to her was plain, but his burn and his bitterness suggested more than a hired hand's devotion. And Lyle, his Polish, was a veneer, hiding a man who dealt in figures and risks, not all of them honest. She turned her gaze to the farmhouse, its stone walls solid but its windows dark, as if mourning its master. Ellen had mentioned money troubles, and Lyle's policy loomed large in that shadow. Insurance, Miss Marple knew, could be a motive as old as greed itself. Had Giles discovered something amiss? Had he threatened to expose Lyle? Or was the fire meant to conceal another crime, one that Bradley's anger or Yet's resentment might have sparked? The constable's voice broke her reverie, calling to his officer about securing the scene. Miss Marple stepped back, her presence unnoticed by the bustling men. She had seen enough for now the suspects' faces, their half-truths, the clues, hidden in ash and glass. She would return to her cottage, to her tea and her knitting, but her thoughts would remain here, sifting through the morning's observations like threads in a tapestry. As she walked back to the village, the church bell tolled noon, its sombre note echoing over the fields. Miss Marple's steps were slow, deliberate, but her mind raced. The four suspects were bound to this tragedy, each by their own thread of motive, love, loyalty, or profit. She would follow those threads, patiently, methodically, until the pattern emerged. For now, she would listen, observe, and wait. The truth, she knew, had a way of revealing itself to those who watched closely. Chapter 3. The Widow's Tale. Afternoon sun cast long shadows across the fields of St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple approached the Giles farmhouse, a sturdy stone building nestled among elms at the edge of the village. The air was crisp, tinged with the lingering bitterness of smoke, and the distant ruin of the barn was a dark smudge against the horizon. In her gloved hand, Miss Marple carried a small jar of quince jelly, its amber glow a pretext for her visit. She knew the value of such gestures. A neighbourly offering could loosen tongues where direct questions might fail. Her purpose was clear: to speak with Ellen Giles, the farmer's widow, whose quiet demeanour at the barn had hinted at depths yet unexplored. The farmhouse door was answered by a weary-looking maid, barely out of her teens, who ushered Miss Marple into a parlour that smelled of wax polish and sorrow. The room was tidy but stark, its furnishings worn from years of user-sagging sofa, a mahogany table scarred with rings from countless cups, a hearth where a low fire crackled. Ellen Giles rose from a chair by the window, her movements slow, as if each step carried the weight of her loss. She was a woman of middle years, her brown hair streaked with grey and pinned neatly, her face pale but composed, with eyes that held a quiet intensity. "Miss Marple," Ellen said, her voice soft but steady, "it's kind of you to call." She gestured to a chair, and Miss Marple settled into it, placing the jelly on the table with a murmured explanation of neighbourly concern. Ellen's lips curved in a faint, polite smile, but her hands, clasped in her lap, betrayed a slight tremor. "I shan't keep you long, Mrs. Giles," Miss Marple began, her tone gentle as a summer breeze. "I only wished to offer my condolences and see how you're managing. Such a dreadful shock, losing Mr. Giles so suddenly." Her eyes, bright and searching, rested on Ellen's face, noting every flicker of expression. Ellen nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. "It's been hard," she admitted. "John was a strong man, set in his ways. The farm was his life, and the barn." Her voice caught, and she paused, drawing a breath. "The barn was his pride. He'd spend hours there, checking the stores, the tools. Said it was the heart of the farm." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of sympathetic interest. "He must have been terribly worried, then, with the troubles you mentioned at the barn this morning. Money, you said." She let the question hang, light as a feather, but her mind was sharp, ready to catch any hint of truth. Elon's fingers tightened briefly. Yes, money was always on his mind. The farm's not what it was, bad harvests, rising costs. John said the barn was insured for a good sum, enough to tide us over if anything happened. He'd been talking to Mr. Lyle about it, going over the papers. They had words, I think, a few days ago. Her voice was even, but Miss Marple caught the hesitation, the careful choice of words. Miss Marple prompted, her tone as mild as if she were discussing the weather. Mr. Lyle seems a polished sort, but those city types can be particular about their business, can't they? Ellen's eyes flicked up, meeting Miss Marple's for a moment before sliding away. John didn't trust him, not entirely, said. Lyle was too keen to push the policy, to make it bigger than we needed. John thought, well, he thought there was something off about it, but he never told me more. She reached for the teapot, pouring with a steadiness that seemed practiced. Would you like a cup, Miss Marple? Thank you, dear, Miss Marple said, accepting the cup but watching Elon's hands. The widow's composure was admirable, but there was a brittleness to it, like porcelain that might crack under pressure. It must be difficult, managing alone now. I suppose Mr. Harper, isn't it, has been a help to you. At the mention of Jed, Ellen's face softened, a fleeting warmth breaking through her reserve. Jed's been loyal, she said. He's worked for us 3 years, never complained, though John could be hard on him. Paid him little enough, I'm ashamed to say. But Jed stayed, said the farm was home. Her voice held a note of gratitude, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes lingered on the window, as if expecting to see the hired hand in the yard beyond. Loyalty is a rare thing, Miss Marple mused, sipping her tea. Especially in a young man like that. I saw him at the barn this morning, looking quite distressed. He must feel the loss keenly. She paused, letting the silence invite more. Ellen's cup clinked softly against its saucer. He does, she said quietly. Jed thought the world of John, in his way. But John could be sharp, you know. He'd snap at Jed over small things, a broken tool, a late chore. I tried to smooth things over, make it easier for Jed. He's a good lad, doesn't deserve to be caught up in this. Her voice held a fierceness, a protectiveness that made Miss Marple's eyebrows lift slightly. And Mr. Bradley, your neighbour, Miss Marple said, shifting the conversation with the ease of a needle slipping through wool. I hear he and your husband had their differences. Land disputes, they say. Ellen's lips tightened, and she set her cup down. Tom Bradley's been a thorn in John's side for years. That strip of land by the copse he claims it's his, says his father's. Deed proves it. John wouldn't hear of it, said the boundary was settled long ago. They argued about it again last week, shouting fit to wake the village. I saw Tom near the barn at dusk, the night before the fire, but I didn't think much of it then. Her voice faltered, and she looked away, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy, but her mind was racing. Bradley near the barn at dusker, detail not mentioned at the scene, and Ellen's protectiveness toward Jed, her unease about Lyle, her mention of the were threads in a pattern that was beginning to take shape. She set her cup down and rose, smoothing her skirt. You've been most kind, Mrs. Giles, letting me intrude at such a time. I'll leave you to your rest, but do call if you need anything. We're neighbours, after all. Ellen stood, her smile, strained but grateful. Thank you, Miss Marple. The jelly's a kindness. I'll manage. She saw Miss Marple to the door, and as the older woman stepped into the yard, she glanced back to see Ellen standing in the doorway, her figure small against the looming house, her eyes distant. The walk back to the village was brisk, the autumn air sharp against Miss Marple's cheeks. Her mind sifted through the conversation, weighing each word like a grocer measuring flour. Ellen's grief was genuine, but there was something beneath it, a wariness, perhaps, or a secret she held close. Her mention of Lyle's disagreement with Giles was telling. Insurance policies, Miss Marple knew, could be as dangerous as any weapon in the wrong hands. And Bradley's presence near the barn, coupled with his feud, painted him as a man with opportunity and motive. Jed's loyalty, meanwhile, was a double-edged sword devotion could turn to resentment under pressure. And that burn on his wrist was a question mark in her mind as she passed the church, its steeple casting a shadow across the path. Miss Marple recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead years ago, a quarrel over money, a fire, a death that was no accident. The human heart, she thought, was predictable in its passions, whether for love, greed, or revenge. Ellen's protectiveness toward Jed suggested a bond that might complicate matters, while her unease about Lyle hinted at a deeper mistrust. Bradley's temper was a known quantity, but was it enough to drive him to murder? And Lyle, with his polished charm, was a man who knew the value of appearances perhaps too well. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resumed, but her thoughts far from the blue wool in her hands. The widow's tale had given her much to ponder, but it was only the beginning. She would visit Bradley next, then Jed, and perhaps Lyle in his town office. Each would reveal something, willingly or not, and Miss Marple was patient. The truth, like a stitch dropped in a complex pattern, would show itself in time. For now, she sipped her tea and let the threads of suspicion weave themselves into clarity. Chapter 4. The neighbour's grievance. The late afternoon light bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden haze as Miss Jane Marple made her way along the narrow lane to Tom Bradley's cottage, a squat, weathered dwelling that crouched at the edge of a muddy field. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the faint, lingering bitterness of smoke from the distant ruin of Giles' barn. In her hand, she carried a small basket of apples from her garden, a neighbourly gesture that would serve as her entry into Bradley's guarded world. Miss Marple knew the value of such offerings. They disarmed suspicion and opened doors, both literal and figurative. Her purpose was to unravel the thread of Bradley's feud with Giles, a grievance that had festered like a wound in the village's memory. The cottage was a picture of neglect, its thatch patchy and its walls streaked with moss. Tools lay scattered about the yard, a rusted pitchfork, a splintered rake, a coil of rope half buried in the mud. Miss Marple knocked lightly, her gloved hand steady, and the door creaked open to reveal Tom Bradley himself, his burly frame filling the doorway. His face was lined with years of sun and anger, his eyes narrowing at the sight of a visitor. "Miss Marple," he grunted, his voice rough as the gravel underfoot. "What brings you here?" "I was passing by, Mr. Bradley," she said, her tone as mild as a spring breeze, "and thought you might like some apples from my tree. They're Cox's orange pippins, quite fine this year." She held out the basket, her smile gentle but her eyes sharp, noting the mud-caked boots by the door and the faint whiff of kerosene that clung to the air. Bradley hesitated, then took the basket with a curt nod. "Obliged," he muttered, stepping aside to let her in. The interior was as cluttered as the yard, with a low ceiling and a table strewn with papers, tools, and an empty bottle of stout. A fire smouldered in the grate, casting flickering shadows. On the walls, Bradley gestured to a chair, its cushion sagging, and Miss Marple sat, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "It's a sad business about Mr. Giles," she began, her voice soft but deliberate. "Such a loss for the village, and so sudden. I saw you at the barn this morning, looking quite shaken. You and he were neighbors, weren't you? It must weigh heavily." Bradley's scowl deepened, and he sank into a chair opposite her, his hands gripping the arms as if to anchor himself. "Giles was no friend of mine," he said bluntly. "A hard man, always looking to get the better of you. That barn burning's a tragedy, sure, but I ain't shedding tears for him." His tone was defiant, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in his eyes, the way his fingers tightened on the chair. She tilted her head, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "I've heard there was some trouble between you over land, wasn't it? These disputes can be so trying. My nephew's gardener once had a row with a neighbor over a hedge, and it went on for years." Her voice was light, almost gossipy, but her words were a probe, testing the waters of Bradley's temper. His face darkened, and he leaned forward, his voice low and fierce. "Trouble, eh? Giles cheated me out of half an acre by the copse. My father's deed marked it clear, but Giles had his own papers, said they trumped mine. Called me a liar to my face last week, right in that barn. Said he'd see me in court before he gave an inch." Bradley's fists clenched, and Miss Marple noted the knuckles, white with pressure, and the faint tremor in his hands. "That must have been terribly provoking," she said, her tone soothing. "To have your rights questioned like that. Where were you, Mr. Bradley, when the fire broke out? It must have been a shock, seeing the flames so close to your own land." Bradley's eyes narrowed, and he leaned back, his posture stiff. "I was mending fences by the brook, like I told Harrow, far from the barn. Didn't see nothing till the smoke woke me, near midnight. My wife will tell you I was home after that, asleep." His words were firm, but Miss Marple caught the slight hesitation, the way his gaze slid to the side, toward a scarf draped over a chair. It was coarse wool, stained with dirt and something darker, ash, perhaps, or soot. She nodded, her expression unchanged. But her mind catalogued the details: the scarf, the boots, the kerosene scent. "It's a mercy your own fields were spared," she said. "Fires can be so unpredictable. I suppose you've had to deal with such things before, living so close to the land." Bradley grunted, relaxing slightly. You learn to handle fires, burn off stubble sometimes to clear the fields. Takes care, mind you, kerosene's tricky stuff. One spark, and it's gone." He stopped abruptly, as if realizing he'd said too much, and his scowl returned. "Look, Miss Marple, I don't know nothing about Giles' fire. I had my own work to mind." "Of course," she said, rising with a gentle smile. "I wouldn't dream of keeping you from it. Thank you for the chat, Mr. Bradley. Do enjoy the apples." She moved toward the door, pausing to glance at the scarf again. Its edge was frayed, and the dark stains seemed fresher than the dirt around. She filed the observation away, along with Bradley's quick mention of kerosene, a slip, perhaps, or a clue. As she stepped into the yard, Bradley followed, his bulk looming behind her. "Mind your step," he said gruffly, but his eyes were wary, watching her as she picked her way across the muddy ground. Miss Marple smiled her thanks and walked on, her steps slow but purposeful. The lane back to the village was quiet, the fields stretching out under a sky now tinged with the first hints of dusk. Her thoughts, however, were far from tranquil. Bradley's anger was no surprise. The village had long known of his feud with Giles. But his mention of kerosene, so casual yet so pointed, was a thread she could not ignore. Those boots, too, bore traces of ash, not just mud, and the scarf stain suggested more than a day's labor. Had Bradley been at the barn, as Ellen had hinted, not just at dusk, but later, when the fire began? His alibi, supported only by... His wife was thin, and Miss Marple knew that spouses could be persuaded to stretch the truth for love or fear. She recalled a case from years past, when a farmer in St. Mary Mead had quarrelled with a neighbour over a shared well. The dispute had ended in a broken fence and a poisoned dog. Not murder, but the bitterness had been the samer, slow poison that could turn to violence. Bradley's grievance was deeper, tied to land and pride, and his temper was a spark that needed little to ignite. Yet she wondered if his anger was too obvious, a distraction from a subtler hand at work. As she neared her cottage, the church bell chimed, its notes clear in the still air. Miss Marple's mind turned to the other suspects. Ellen's grief had been real, but her protectiveness toward Jed hinted at a bond that might complicate matters. Jed himself, with his burn and his bitterness, was a puzzle oil, yet strained by Giles' harshness. And Lyle, with his smooth talk of insurance, was a man who thrived on calculation. Bradley's temper was but one piece of the pattern, and Miss Marple knew she must weave the others into it. She settled into her parlour, the fire casting a warm glow over her knitting, which lay untouched on the table. The apples had served their purpose, but the conversation had yielded more a glimpse into Bradley's soul and a hint of something darker. She would visit Jed next, perhaps at the farm, where his guard might be lower. For now, she sipped tea and let her thoughts unravel the day's findings, each detail a stitch in the tapestry of truth she was determined to complete. Chapter 5. The hired hand's secret. The evening shadows were lengthening across St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple made her way toward the village pub, the Blue Boar, where she had learned Jed Harper often spent his evenings. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys, a reminder of the tragedy that still hung over the village like a pall. In her hand, she carried a small parcel of knitted socks, a gift for the vicar's charity drive, but also a convenient excuse for her presence in the pub. Miss Marple knew that men like Jed, guarded by nature, might speak more freely over a pint than in the formal light of day. Her aim was to probe the hired hand's loyalty, his bitterness, and the curious burn mark she had noticed on his wrist at the barn. The Blue Boar was a low, timbered building with a sagging roof and windows that glowed with the warm light of oil lamps. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of ale, pipe smoke, and the murmur of voices. Farmers, labourers, and shopkeepers unwinding after a long day. Miss Marple stepped inside, her unassuming figure in its neat tweed coat and hat drawing little attention. She spotted Jed Harper at once, seated alone in a corner, his wiry frame hunched over a pint of dark ale. His cap was pulled low, and his hands, rough with the calluses of farm work, toyed with the glass, betraying a restlessness that matched his demeanour at the barn. She approached the bar, where Mr. Pym, the landlord, greeted her with a surprised but courteous nod. Miss Marple. "Not often we see you here," he said, wiping a glass with a cloth. "What'll it be?" "Just a glass of lemonade, Mr. Pym," she replied, her voice soft and pleasant. "I'm dropping off some socks for the vicar's charity, but I thought I'd rest a moment. It's been a trying day, hasn't it, with poor Mr. Giles' death?" Her eyes, bright and observant, flicked toward Jed, who had glanced up at the mention of Giles' name. Pym's face grew solemn. "Aye, a bad business. Folk are saying it's no accident. Jed over there's been quiet as a mouse since it happened. Worked for Giles, you know." He lowered his voice, leaning closer. "Some say he had no love for the man, though he's loyal to Mrs. Giles." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle concern. "Loyalty is a fine thing, but it can be tested, can't it? I'll have a word with him, perhaps offer some comfort." She took her lemonade and the parcel of socks and moved toward Yet's table, her steps slow but purposeful. "Mr. Harper," she said, pausing by his side, "may I join you for a moment? I've been running errands for the vicar, and my old legs need a rest." Her smile was disarming, and Jed, though startled, gestured to the empty chair opposite him. "Suppose so, Miss Marple," he muttered, his voice gruff but not unkind. His eyes, dark and wary, studied her briefly before returning to his glass. The burn on his wrist was more visible now, a red, blistered patch peeking from under his sleeve, and Miss Marple noted it with care, though she gave no sign. "It's a dreadful thing what happened to Mr. Giles," she began, setting her lemonade and parcel on the table. "I saw you at the barn this morning, looking quite shaken. You must have been fond of him, working so closely together." Her tone was sympathetic, but her words were a gentle probe, testing the waters of his mood. Jed's jaw tightened, and he took a long sip of his ale. "Fond ain't the word," he said, his voice low. "Giles was a hard man, miss. Worked me to the bone for wages that barely kept me fed. But I stayed, didn't I, for the farm?" For he stopped, his eyes flicking away, and Miss Marple caught the unspoken name, Ellen, for Mrs. Giles, perhaps, she suggested, her voice as soft as a whisper. "She speaks highly of you, you know. Says you've been a great help, especially now." Jet's face softened, a flicker of warmth breaking through his guarded expression. "She's a good woman, Mrs. Giles. Doesn't deserve what's happened. Always kind to me, even when Giles was barking orders. I'd do anything for her." His voice held a fierce edge, and Miss Marple noted the intensity, the way his hand gripped the glass. "That's a fine thing to hear," she said, sipping her lemonade. "Loyalty like that is rare. But it must have been trying, working under such a demanding employer. I've known men like Mr. Giles. My cousin's gardener was much the same, always grumbling about his help." "Did he ever push you too far, Mr. Harper?" Jet's eyes narrowed, and he shifted in his seat. "He pushed, all right. Snapped at me over every little thing, a loose bale, a dull blade. Last week, he docked my pay for a broken rake, said it was my fault. I took it, didn't I? Had to." His voice was bitter, and Miss Marple saw the burn on his wrist flex as his hand tightened. "That burn looks painful," she remarked, her tone one of innocent concern. "Did you get that working? On the farm, fires can be so dangerous, can't they?" Jet's hand jerked, pulling his sleeve down to cover the mark. "Just a mishap," he muttered. "Was fixing a lantern a few days back. Got careless. Nothing to do with the barn." His words were quick, too quick, and Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the flush creeping up his neck. "Of course," she said, her smile unchanged. "Lanterns can be tricky things. Where were you, Mr. Harper, when the fire started?" It must have been a shock, waking to such a blaze. He leaned back, his gaze fixed on the table. "In my bunk, like I told Harrow, out by the shed, a good ways from the barn. Didn't hear nothing till the shouting woke me folks running. calling for water. By then, it was too late. His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers drummed on the glass, a restless rhythm that betrayed unease. She nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy. It must be hard, carrying on now, with Mrs. Giles so alone. You'll stay on, I suppose, to help her manage. Jet's eyes met hers, a flash of determination in them. I'll stay as long as she needs me. She's got no one else, not really. Bradley's no friend, and that insurance man, Lyle, he's all talk, no heart. I don't trust him. His voice dropped, and Miss Marple caught the edge of suspicion, the hint of something more. Mr. Lyle does seem rather smooth, she said, her tone light. I've met men like him before, always with an answer, but not always the truth. Did you see much of him at the farm? Jed shrugged, but his eyes were wary. He was around, talking to Giles about that policy, always smiling like he owned the place. Giles didn't like him much, said he was pushing too hard. I saw him by the barn a few days ago, looking at the beams like he was measuring them. He stopped, as if realizing he'd said more than intended, and took another sip of ale. Miss Marple sipped her lemonade, her mind cataloguing his words. The burn, the bitterness, the loyalty to Ellen, the suspicion of Lyle were pieces in the puzzle. She rose, gathering her parcel. You've been most kind, Mr. Harper, letting an old woman chatter. I must get these socks to the vicar. Do take care of that burn, it looks sore. She smiled, her eyes lingering on his wrist for a moment, before she turned to leave. Jed nodded, his expression guarded but not hostile. Good night, Miss Marple, he said, his voice low. As she stepped into the cool evening air, she felt his gaze on her back, a weight of unspoken thoughts. The walk to her cottage was quiet, the village settling into its nightly hush. Miss Marple's thoughts were anything but quiet, however. Yet, devotion to Ellen was clear, but his bitterness toward Giles was a spark that could have ignited more than a lantern. That burn mark, so quickly hidden, was no mere accident, she suspected, and his mention of Lyle by the barn, measuring beams, added a new thread to the pattern. Was Jed deflecting suspicion, or had he seen something damning? She recalled a young man from St. Mary Mead years ago, a gardener's lad who'd nursed a grudge against his master. His anger had led to a stolen watch, not murder, but the resentment had been the same, slow burn that could flare under pressure. Jet's loyalty to Ellen was a complication. It could be a motive to protect her, or a reason to act against Giles. The burn, the ale-loosened tongue, the hint about Lyle were clues, and Miss Marple tucked them away, ready for the next stitch in her investigation. Chapter 6. The Agent's Charm. The morning mist still clung to the fields of St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple boarded the early bus to the nearby town of Much Benham, where Vernon Lyle kept his insurance office. The journey was short, but the rattling vehicle gave her time to reflect on the threads she had gathered thus far. Bradley's temper, Ellen's guarded grief, Jed's loyalty tinged with resentment. Now her focus turned to Lyle, the polished outsider whose smooth demeanor at the barn had struck her as a carefully crafted mask. She carried a small notebook in her handbag, ostensibly for jotting down shopping lists, but its pages held her observations, each detail a stitch in the tapestry of the case. Her mission today was to probe Lyle's charm, to see what lay beneath his polished surface. Much Benham was a bustling market town, its streets lined with shops and offices that contrasted with the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead. Lyle's office, was a narrow building squeezed between a haberdashery and a tea shop, its brass plaque gleaming with the words Vernon Lyle, Insurance and Assurance. Miss Marple pushed open the door, a bell jingling above, and stepped into a room that exuded order-polished wood panels, a tidy desk, and shelves lined with ledgers. The air smelled of ink and wax, and Lyle himself rose from behind the desk, his smile as bright as his cufflinks. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise," he said, his voice smooth as polished glass. "Do come in. I'd offer you tea, but my clerk's out this morning. Perhaps a glass of water." His eyes, sharp and calculating, belied the warmth of his words, and Miss Marple noted the way he adjusted his tie, a small gesture of control. "Thank you, Mr. Lyle, but I shan't trouble you," she said, settling into a chair with a gentle smile. "I was in town for some errands and thought to stop by. You were so kind at the barn yesterday, and I've been meaning to ask about insurance for my cottage. One hears such dreadful things, like poor Mr. Giles' fire." Her tone was light, almost chatty, but her eyes were keen, watching his reaction. Lyle's smile tightened, just for a moment, before he leaned back in his chair, his hands folded neatly. "A terrible tragedy," he said, his voice rich with practiced sympathy. "Poor Giles. His barn was insured, of course a substantial policy, given its value to the farm. I advised him myself, you know. Sensible man, wanted to protect his livelihood." He gestured to a stack of papers on his desk, as if to emphasize his professionalism. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of innocent curiosity. "It must be such a comfort to Mrs. Giles, knowing the farm is secure. But I heard there was some disagreement about the policy. My nephew's friend once had a dreadful time with an insurance man, something about terms not being clear." Her voice was gentle, but her words were a probe, testing the waters of Lyle's composure. His smile faltered, and he cleared his throat. "Disagreement? Oh, nothing serious. Giles was a cautious man, liked to ask questions. We went over the policy, a few days ago. Routine, really. He wanted to be sure the coverage was adequate. I assured him it was." His fingers tapped lightly on the desk, a rhythm Miss Marple noted as she sipped the air, pretending to consider his words. "That's reassuring," she said. "Fires are so unpredictable, aren't they? I suppose you've seen many claims like this in your work. Was there anything unusual about Mr. Giles' policy?" She tilted her head, her eyes bright with feigned ignorance, but her mind was sharp, catching the slight stiffening of Lyle's shoulders. "Unusual? Not at all," he said, his voice a shade too quick. "Standard policy, tailored to the farm's needs. The barn was old but valuable equipment, hay, all insured at market rates. The fire was a tragedy, but the claim will help Mrs. Giles rebuild." He leaned forward, his smile returning, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Now, about your cottage, Miss Marple, shall I draw up a quote?" She waved a hand, dismissing the offer with a smile. "Oh, I'm not quite ready yet, Mr. Lyle. But tell me, were you at the farm often? I imagine you must get to know your clients well, visiting their properties." Her tone was casual, but her question was deliberate, seeking to place him at the scene. Lyle's fingers paused on the desk. "Not often," he said. "I was there a few days ago, as I said, to discuss the policy. Giles showed me the barn, wanted my opinion on its condition. Solid structure, or so it seemed." He shrugged, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in his eyes, the way his gaze darted to the window, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "That must have been a help to him," she said. though I heard the fire started so quickly, almost as if it was no accident. The constable mentioned arson, didn't he? Such a dreadful thought. Her voice was soft, but her words were a needle, pricking at his calm. Lyle's smile froze, and he leaned back, his hands folding tightly. Arson, a terrible accusation. I wouldn't know about that, Miss Marple. My job's to assess risk, not investigate fires. The police will sort it out, I'm sure. His tone was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the beads of sweat on his brow, the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for a pen. Of course, she said, rising with a gentle nod. You've been most kind, Mr. Lyle. I'll think about that quote and let you know. For now, I must get on with my errands. She moved toward the door, pausing to glance at a framed certificate on the wall, a professional accolade. Its edges slightly curled, as if it had been hung in haste. Lyle stood, escorting her out with a flourish. Any time, Miss Marple. My door's always open. His smile was back, but it was a shade less confident, and Miss Marple felt his gaze on her as she stepped into the street. The town was busy now, with shoppers and carts clogging the narrow roads. Miss Marple walked slowly, her mind sifting through the conversation. Lyle's charm was a veneer, thin and brittle, and his unease at the mention of arson was telling. His claim of routine business with Giles rang hollow. The policy, with its substantial sum, was a motive that loomed large, and his presence at the barn, inspecting beams, as Jed had mentioned, suggested more than a casual visit. Had he been looking for weaknesses to exploit or covering his tracks? She recalled a case from years ago when a slick salesman in St. Mary Mead had swindled a widow with false promises. His charm had been his weapon, but his greed had been his undoing. Lyle, with his polished shoes and calculated smiles, was cut from similar cloth. The policy, the visit, the fire-all pointed to a man who played with figures and risks. Perhaps too cleverly, as she boarded the bus back to the village, Miss Marple opened her notebook, jotting down a few words. Lyle Policy Barn, visit. The pieces were falling into place, but the pattern was not yet clear. Bradley's temper, Ellen's secrets, Jed's Bernal were threads, but Lyle's role was a knot she needed to untangle. She would speak to the vicar next, to gather the villagers' whispers, and perhaps revisit the barn's ruins. For now, she leaned back, the bus's hum a backdrop to her thoughts, as she wove the day's findings into the growing tapestry of truth. Chapter 7. The Village Whispers. The soft light of a late October morning filtered through the lace curtains of St. Mary Mead's post office, where Miss Jane Marple stood at the counter, her small parcel of letters in hand. The air was crisp with the scent of ink and paper, mingled with the faint sweetness of toffee from a jar on the shelf. Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, bustled behind the counter, her eyes bright with the unspoken thrill of village gossip. Miss Marple, with her gentle smile and unassuming air, knew this was the place to gather the threads of rumour that wove through St. Mary Mead like veins in a leaf. Her visits to Bradley, Jed, and Lyle had sharpened her suspicions, but the villagers' whispers could add colour and shape to the pattern forming in her mind. "Good morning, Miss Weatherby," Miss Marple said, her voice as mild as the autumn breeze. "I've a few letters to post, and I thought I'd stop for a chat. Such a sad business about Mr. Giles, isn't it? The whole village seems abuzz." She placed her parcel on the counter, her eyes noting the way Miss Weatherby's hands paused, eager to share. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful," Miss Weatherby exclaimed, leaning forward, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "They're saying it was no accident. That fire, murder, plain as day, and poor Mrs. Giles left all alone. I saw her in church yesterday, looking like a ghost. Do you think she knew something?" Her eyes gleamed with curiosity, and Miss Marple noted the hint of speculation, a common thread in village talk. "It's hard to say," Miss Marple replied, her tone thoughtful. "Grief can mask many things, but people will talk, won't they? Have you heard anything particular about the fire or about Mr. Giles' troubles?" She adjusted her hat, her gesture casual but her attention sharp, ready to catch any stray thread of truth. Miss Weatherby's voice dropped lower, as if the walls might carry her words. "Well, Mrs. Price at the bakery swears she saw Mr. Lyle's car parked near the farm 3 days before the fire. Not just the once he admitted to. Said he was there late, near dusk, and not in his usual suit, more like he was sneaking about. And Tommy, the butcher's boy, told me Jed Harper bought a tin of lamp oil at the general store the day before it happened. Odd, don't you think, when the farm's got plenty of oil in the shed?" She paused, her eyes wide, inviting Miss Marple to share her thoughts. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile, her mind filing away the details. "How curious," she said. "Young Tommy's got sharp eyes, hasn't he? And Mrs. Price is always so observant. Anything else about the others, Mr. Bradley, perhaps?" Her voice was light, but her question was deliberate, probing the villagers' collective memory. Miss Weatherby nodded eagerly. "Oh, Bradley's been a storm cloud for years over that land dispute. Old Mr. Cobb, who's always at the Blue Boar, says he heard Bradley muttering about burning Giles out last month, after they had that row in the market. Drunk talk, maybe, but it makes you wonder." She straightened, glancing at the door as if expecting eavesdroppers. "And then there's Mrs. Giles. Folks say she and Jed Harper are closer than they ought to be, if you catch my meaning. Not that I believe it, mind you, she's a proper lady-but-tongues wag." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle concern. "Tongues do wag, don't they? But there's often a grain of truth in gossip, if one knows where to look. Thank you, Miss Weatherby. You've been most helpful." She paid for her stamps and turned to leave, her mind already sifting through the new threads. Lyle's car, Jed's oil, Bradley's threat, and the hint of scandal around Ellen. Her next stop was the tea shop, a cozy nook where Mrs. Price held court, her apron dusted with flour and her tongue as quick as her rolling pin. The shop was busy, with villagers lingering over scones and gossip, and Miss Marple slipped into a corner table, ordering a pot of Earl Grey. Mrs. Price, spotting her, bustled over, her round face alight with the chance to talk. "Miss Marple, you've heard about the fire, I suppose," Mrs. Price said, setting down the teapot with a clink. "It's all anyone talks about. I told Miss Weatherby I saw that Lyle fellow's car by the farm, clear as day, 3 days back. Not his usual visit, either. He was parked off the lane, half hidden by the trees, like he didn't want to be seen." Her voice was low, her eyes darting to the other customers. Miss Marple poured her tea, her movements slow and deliberate. "How very odd," she said. "Mr. Lyle seems such an open sort, always smiling. Did you see him at the barn itself, Mrs. Price?" Her question was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, catching the baker's wife's hesitation. "Not at the barn, no," Mrs. Price admitted. "But he was close enough, and it wasn't his usual time for calling. I thought it queer, him being there so late. And then there's Jed Harper. Tommy says he was in a state the day before the fire, buying that oil and looking all jumpy. You don't think he'd do something rash, do you?" Her voice held a mix of fear and excitement, the thrill of scandal. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over the details. "Young men can be impulsive," she said, "but Jed seems loyal to Mrs. Giles. It's a sad thing when loyalty is tested. And Mr. Bradley, has he been in, talking about his troubles with Mr. Giles?" She let the question hang, knowing Mrs. Price's love for detail. "Oh, Bradley's been grumbling for weeks," Mrs. Price said, leaning closer. "Came in last week, face like thunder, saying Giles would regret crossing him. Said that land by the copse was his birthright, and he'd fight for it. I didn't think much of it then, just Bradley being Bradley, but now, with the fire." She trailed off, her eyes wide with implication. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged, but her thoughts racing. The villagers' whispers were a chorus of Cluslyle's secretive visit, Jed's purchase, Bradley's threats, and a hint of Ellen's closeness to Jed. Each was a thread, but none yet formed a complete picture. She thanked Mrs. Price, left a coin for the tea, and stepped back into the street, her mind weaving the gossip into her growing tapestry as she walked toward her cottage. She passed old Mr. Cobb, swaying slightly on his way to the Blue Boar. "Morning, Miss Marple," he mumbled, his breath heavy with last night's ale. "Bad business, that fire. Bradley said he'd burn Giles out, you know. Heard him myself." He shuffled on, leaving Miss Marple to ponder his words. Back in her parlour, she settled by the fire, her knitting untouched as she opened her notebook. She jotted down the new details. Lyle car near farm, dusk, 3 days prior. Jed lamp oil, jumpy. Bradley threat to burn out Giles. Ellen and Jed rumours of closeness. The fire was no accident, she was certain, and these whispers pointed to motives: greed, revenge, perhaps even love. She recalled a village scandal years ago, when gossip about a stolen will had led to a confrontation, not murder, but the whispers had held the key. Here, too, the truth lay in the chatter. If she could sift it carefully. Miss Marple closed her notebook, her thoughts turning to the barn itself. She would ask Constable Harrow for permission to visit the ruins again, to search for the glass, shard she had seen, or other clues overlooked in the chaos. For now, she sipped her tea, the fire crackling softly, and let the villagers' whispers guide her next steps. The truth was close, hidden in the murmurs of St. Mary Mead, and she would find it, one thread at a time. Chapter 8. The clue in the ashes. The pale light of an overcast afternoon hung over St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple approached the charred remains of Farmer Giles' barn, her sensible shoes crunching on the ash-strewn path. The air was heavy, with the acrid residue of smoke, a stark reminder of the violence that had shattered the villagers' quiet. She carried her umbrella, though the sky threatened no rain, its weight a comforting pretext for her presence at the scene. Constable Harrow had granted her permission to visit, albeit with a sceptical frown, assuming the elderly spinster's interest was mere curiosity. Miss Marple, however, had no intention of merely looking. She sought the small, overlooked details that might unravel the knot of this murder. The barn's skeleton loomed before her, its blackened beams jutting like broken bones against the grey sky. The fire brigade had trampled much of the ground, but patches of undisturbed ash remained, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned them with purpose. She recalled the glint of glass she had seen the previous day, a shard that suggested more than an accident. Her visits to Bradley, Jed, Lyle, and Ellen, coupled with the villagers' whispers, had woven a pattern of motives: greed, revenge, loyalty, but the truth lay in the physical traces left behind, and she meant to find them. Constable Harrow was at the far end of the ruins, conferring with a young officer who held a clipboard. Miss Marple approached, her demeanour meek but her resolve firm. "Good afternoon, Constable," she said, her voice soft as a whisper in church. "Thank you for letting me have a look. It's such a sad sight, isn't it? I thought I might offer a prayer for poor Mr. Giles." Her words were a gentle cloak, hiding her true intent. Harrow nodded, his broad face creased with fatigue. "Aye, Miss Marple, it's a grim business. Mind your step, though the ground's treacherous. And we're still sifting through. Haven't found much yet, just ash and bits of metal." He turned back to his officer, dismissing her presence, and Miss Marple was glad of it. She preferred to work unnoticed, her unassuming figure blending into the scene like a shadow. She moved carefully along the edge of the ruins, her umbrella tapping the ground as if to steady her steps. The barn's foundation was still intact, a rectangle of scorched stone that outlined its former shape. She paused near the spot where she had seen the glass shard, her eyes scanning the ash. There it was, half buried, a fragment of green glass, its edges melted smooth by the fire's heat. She bent, as if adjusting her shoe, and studied it closely without touching it. A bottle, she thought, likely used to hold kerosene or some other accelerant. Its presence was no accident, and she noted its position near a charred beam where the fire had burned hottest. As she straightened, another glint caught her eye, closer to the barn's entrance. She stepped toward it, her movements slow to avoid drawing Harrow's attention. It was a metal pen, its surface blackened but intact, with the initials VL engraved on its side. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. Vernon Lyle's pen, she was certain, a careless relic of his presence. She slipped it into her handbag, knowing Harrow's men would overlook such a small item, and continued her inspection, her mind racing. Near the pen, caught in a crevice of the foundation, was a scrap of cloth, singed but recognizable. It bore a faint pattern of blue checks, similar to the apron Ellen Giles had worn during Miss Marple's visit to the farmhouse. She frowned, her thoughts turning. Had Ellen been here during the fire, or was this a deliberate plant to shift suspicion? The cloth was too small to be accidental, yet too obvious to be innocent. She left it in place, noting its location, and moved on, her eyes sweeping the ashes for further clues. The ground near the barn's rear was less disturbed, and here she found faint impressions, boot prints, their edges blurred by heat but distinct, enough to suggest a heavy tread. Bradley's boots, she recalled, had been caked with ash and mud, and these prints matched their size. Yet Jet's restless energy and Lyle's polished shoes could not be ruled out. She knelt, her umbrella shielding her from view, and examined a patch of soot-stained grass. A faint smear of oil glistened, its sharp scent confirming her suspicion of kerosene. The fire had been set deliberately, and these traces were the threads of its making. Miss Marple stood, her mind weaving the clues into the pattern she had begun to see. The glass shard pointed to arson, the pen to Lyle, the cloth to Ellen, and the boot prints to Bradley or perhaps Jed. Each was a piece, but none told the whole story. She recalled a case from St. Mary Mead years ago, when a stolen necklace had been found in a garden shed, its discovery a deliberate misdirection. Here, too, the cloth felt staged, but by whom? Lyle, to deflect suspicion, Ellen, to cover her own tracks, or another hand working in the shadows. She glanced at Harrow, still busy with his officer, and made her way to the edge of the ruins, where a hedge separated the barn from the fields. A faint trail led through the undergrowth, barely visibly a path someone might have taken to approach. Unseen, she followed it a few steps, noting a snapped twig and a crushed leaf, signs of recent passage. Her thoughts turned to Lyle's car, seen by Mrs. Price near the farm, and Yet's purchase of lamp oil. The trail could belong to any of them, or to someone else entirely, but it was another thread in her tapestry. As she turned back, Harrow called out, "Find anything, Miss Marple?" His tone was half amused, half exasperated, as if indulging. "A meddlesome aunt. Just saying a prayer, Constable," she replied, her smile serene. "It's a heavy place, isn't it? I'll leave you to your work." She walked away, her umbrella tapping the ground, her handbag heavier with the weight of the pen. She would not mention it to Harrow yet. The constable was thorough, but lacked imagination, and she needed time to fit this clue into the puzzle back in her cottage. Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting untouched as she opened her notebook. She wrote, "Glass shard kerosene bottle, pen VL Lyle's, Clothland's apron, planted, boot prints Bradley's, oil Smirison confirmed." The clues were mounting, each pointing to a different suspect, yet none conclusive. Lyle's pen was damning, but his charm suggested he was too careful to leave such a trace by accident. The cloth implicated Ellen, but its placement felt too convenient. Bradley's boots and Jet's burn lingered in her mind, each a question mark. She recalled the village whispers Lyle's car, Jet's oil, Bradley's threats. The pen tied Lyle to the scene, but the cloth and prints muddied the waters. She would need to speak to the suspects again, perhaps together, to watch their reactions. For now, she sipped her tea, the fire's glow casting shadows on her notebook. The clues in the ashes were a step closer to the truth, but the final pattern was still hidden, waiting for her patient hands to unravel it. Chapter 9. The Confrontation, the Vicarage of St. Mary Mead, with its ivy-clad walls and mullioned windows, stood as a haven of quiet dignity amid the village's unrest. Miss Jane Marple had chosen it as the setting for her next move, a carefully orchestrated gathering of the four suspects: Dom Bradley, Ellen Giles, Jed Harper, and Vernon Lyle. The pretext was a simple one: tea with the vicar, Mr. Clement, to discuss a memorial fund for Farmer Giles. But Miss Marple's true purpose was to observe the suspects together, to watch their faces and words for the cracks that might reveal the truth. The clues she had gathered, the glass shard, Lyle's pen, the singed cloth, the boot prints had tightened the threads of her suspicions, and she knew a confrontation, however subtle, could loosen the knot of this murder. The vicarage parlour was warm and welcoming, its chintz curtains drawn against the late afternoon chill. A fire crackled in the grate, casting a soft glow over the polished table where a silver tea service gleamed. Mr. Clement, a kindly man with a penchant for absent-mindedness, greeted his guests with a vague smile, unaware of the Miss Marple had set in motion. She sat near the window, her knitting in her lap, her gentle demeanour masking the sharpness of her intent. The suspects arrived one by one, each with a guarded air that spoke of unease. Tom Bradley entered first, his heavy boots cleaned but still bearing faint traces of ash. He nodded curtly to Miss Marple and took a chair by the fire, his scowl fixed, as if carved in stone. Ellen Giles followed, her face pale but composed, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. Jed Harper came next, his wiry frame tense, his eyes darting to Ellen before settling on the floor. Vernon Lyle was last, his polished suit and smooth smile a stark contrast to the other's rustic simplicity. He greeted Mr. Clement with a handshake, his charm undimmed, but his eyes wary as they met Miss Marple's. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple said, her voice soft as she poured tea from the pot. "It's such a kind thought, isn't it, to honour Mr. Giles with a fund for the church? But I confess I've been thinking of the fire, too so dreadful, and the talk of arson makes it all the more troubling." Her words were light, but her eyes moved from face to face, noting Bradley's clenched jaw, Ellen's sudden stillness, Jed's restless hands, and Lyle's tightened smile. Mr. Clement nodded, oblivious to the tension. A sad loss, indeed. The village is poorer without John Giles. I trust Constable Harrow is making progress. His question hung in the air, and Miss Marple seized it, her tone gentle but deliberate. "He's doing his best, I'm sure," she said, "but fires leave so little behind, don't they? Though I did hear they found traces of kerosene and some curious items in the ashes. It's strange how small things can tell a story." She paused, sipping her tea, and let the silence work its magic. Bradley shifted, his voice gruff. "Kerosene's common enough on a farm. Doesn't mean a thing. I told Harrow I was nowhere near the barn that night." His eyes flicked to Ellen, a flash of resentment in them, and Miss Marple noted it, recalling his feud over the land. Ellen's hands trembled slightly as she set down her cup. "John used kerosene for lanterns," she said, her voice low. "But he was careful. He'd never leave it lying about." Her gaze lingered on the table, avoiding Jed, who sat rigid, his fingers twisting the brim of his cap. Miss Marple turned to Lyle, her smile serene. "Mr. Lyle, you know about such things, don't you? Insurance claims often involve fires. Did you ever notice anything amiss when you visited the barn?" Her question was innocent, but her hand brushed her handbag where the pen with V lay hidden. Lyle's smile faltered, and he cleared his throat. "I only saw the barn once, Miss Marple, to assess its value. Solid structure, nothing unusual. As for kerosene, I wouldn't know my jobs with papers, not fuel." His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease, the way his hand adjusted his cuff, covering a faint ink stain. She leaned forward, her tone still mild. "How curious, then, that a pen was found in the ashes, engraved with VL. I suppose it could belong to anyone, but it's such a distinctive thing to lose." She watched Lyle closely, seeing his face pale, his fingers freeze on his cup. "A pen," he said, his voice a shade too sharp. "I lost one weeks ago, must have dropped it somewhere. Could be anyone's, really." His smile returned, but it was strained, and Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow. Despite the cool room, Jet's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "You were at the barn more than once, Lyle. I saw you, poking about the beams like you were looking for something." His voice was low, almost accusing, and Ellen's gaze darted to him, a mix of fear and surprise in her eyes. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "Is that so, Mr. Harper? It's easy to forget details in such. A shock I heard, too, that a scrap of cloth was found blue checks, like an apron. It's strange, isn't it, how such things turn up?" She looked at Ellen, whose face drained of colour, her hands gripping her shawl. "It wasn't mine," Ellen said quickly, her voice trembling. "I was nowhere near the barn that night. I told you I was asleep." Her eyes met Yet's, a silent plea, and Miss Marple noted the way he leaned toward her, protective but tense. Bradley snorted, his voice cutting through the room. "Cloth, pens, what's it matter? Giles was a cheat, and someone settled the score. Don't look at my was mending fences, like I said. His defiance was brittle, and Miss Marple saw the way his eyes avoided hers, lingering on Lyle with suspicion. She set down her cup, her movements deliberate. It's the small things that matter, Mr. Bradley. A pen, a cloth, a boot print, they tell a story, if one listens. The fire was no accident, and someone here knows more than they've said. Her words were soft, but they landed like stones, and the room grew still. The only sound, the crackle of the fire. Lyle laughed, a forced sound. You're quite the detective, Miss Marple. But I'm just an insurance man, and I've nothing to hide. His eyes darted to the door, and Miss Marple noted the tension in his posture, like a man ready to flee. Mr. Clement, sensing the unease, cleared his throat. Well, let's focus on the fund, shall we? A plaque for Mr. Giles, perhaps. His voice was cheerful, but the suspects remained silent, their faces a gallery of guilt, fear, and defiance. Miss Marple rose, her knitting gathered in her hands. A lovely idea, Vicar. I'll leave you all to discuss it. Thank you for the tea. She moved to the door, her steps slow, but her mind was alight with the reactions she had provoked. Lyle's panic, Ellen's fear, Jet's accusation, Bradley's defiance. The pen was a blow to Lyle, the cloth a shock to Ellen, and the interplay between Jed and Bradley hinted at deeper currents as she walked back to her cottage. The evening air sharp against her cheeks, Miss Marple knew she was close to the truth. The confrontation had shaken the suspects, and their cracks were showing. She would need to examine Lyle's policy more closely, perhaps with Harrow's help, and revisit the Barnes clues. For now, she tucked her notebook into her handbag, the pen's weight a reminder of the truth waiting to be unraveled. Chapter 10. The Policy's Secret. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of St. Mary Mead's small library, casting a soft glow over the polished oak tables and rows of leather-bound books. Miss Jane Marple sat in a quiet corner. A stack of insurance pamphlets spread before her, their crisp pages a stark contrast to the grim purpose of her visit. She had come to examine the fine print of Vernon Lyle's policies, suspecting that the key to Farmer Giles' murder lay not only in the ashes of the barn, but in the cold language of contracts. The confrontation at the vicarage had sharpened her focus. Lyle's unease, Ellen's fear, Yet's accusation, and Bradley's defiance had all pointed to the insurance policy as a thread that bound them. Her notebook lay open, its pages filled with meticulous observations, and she intended to add another piece to the puzzle. The library was nearly empty, save for Miss Hartnell, the librarian, who bustled about with a duster, her curiosity barely concealed. Miss Marple had chosen this place for its quiet and its resources, knowing that Lyle's pamphlets, left at the vicarage, might hold clues overlooked by others. She adjusted her glasses, her fingers tracing the dense text of a policy sample, its terms dense with clauses about fire, fraud, and payouts. Her mind, however, was on Lyle's ledger, mentioned briefly during her visit to his office. If Giles had questioned the policy's value, as Ellen had hinted, there might be evidence of tampering, evidence worth killing to conceal. She paused on a clause about fraudulent claims, which voided payouts if proven. How very interesting, she murmured, her voice barely audible. A policy inflated beyond the barn's worth could tempt a man like Lyle, whose charm masked a calculating nature. She recalled his nervous gestures at the vicarage when she mentioned the pen, his pen found in the ashes. Had Giles discovered a discrepancy, threatening to expose Lyle's scheme? The thought was a thread, and she needed to pull it further. Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate, and approached Miss Hartnell. "Good morning, dear," she said, her smile gentle. "I wonder if you've any records of local businesses' insurance offices. Perhaps I'm looking into policies for my cottage, and Mr. Lyle's name came up." Her tone was casual, but her eyes were sharp, knowing the librarian's love for village affairs. Miss Hartnell's face lit up, eager to assist. "Oh, Mr. Lyle's a busy one, isn't he? Always coming and going from much Benham. I don't have records here, but I heard from Mrs. Price that he's been selling big policies lately, more than some folks can afford," said Giles was cross. About it, thought the barn's coverage was too high. She lowered her voice, glancing around. "Mind you, that's just talk." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest. "Talk can be so revealing, can't it? Thank you." Miss Hart. She returned to her table, her mind weaving the librarian's words into her pattern. Giles' suspicion of the policy's value was a motive for Lyle, and the villagers' whispers confirmed it. She needed to see Lyle's records, but that required Constable Harrow's authority. She left the library and made her way to the police station, a small building at the village's edge. Harrow was at his desk, surrounded by papers, his face etched with the strain of the case. "Miss Marple," he said, looking up with a mix of respect and exasperation, "what brings you here?" Still saying prayers for Giles. His tone was gruff, but she sensed his willingness to listen. "I've been thinking, Constable," she said, settling into a chair. "That insurance policy of Mr. Giles, it seems important, doesn't it? Mrs. Giles mentioned he argued with Mr. Lyle about its terms. Could we see the records? There might be something amiss, something well worth a great deal." Her voice was soft, but her words were pointed, and she saw Harrow's eyes narrow. "Amiss," he said, leaning back. "You're thinking fraud, aren't you? Lyle's a slick one, I'll grant you, but we've no proof. Still, I can get a warrant for his books. Been meaning to, after what you said about that pen." He scribbled a note, his pencil blunt but determined. Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene. "You're most kind, Constable. It's just a thought, but small things can lead to big truths, can't they?" She rose, leaving Harrow to his task, and stepped back into the crisp air, her mind alight with possibilities. That afternoon, Harrow called her to join him at Lyle's office in Much Benham, where a warrant had secured the ledgers. Lyle was there. His smile strained as he handed over the books, his eyes darting to Miss Marple with a mix of irritation and fear. The office was as polished as before, but the air was tense, the scent of ink now mingled with unease. Harrow flipped through the ledger, his brow furrowed. Miss Marple stood quietly, her eyes scanning the pages over his shoulder. There, in neat columns, was Giles' policy, its value listed at a sum far higher than the barn's worth, equipment overstated, hay bales doubled. A note in the margin, in Lyle's precise hand, recorded a meeting with Giles 2 days before the fire, where Giles had questioned the figures. He was angry, Lyle admitted, his voice tight. Said he'd report me if the numbers didn't add up. I told him it was a clerical error, nothing more. Miss Marple's gaze met Harrow's, her expression unchanged, but her mind racing. "A clerical error," she said softly. "How unfortunate. And you were at the farm that day, Mr. Lyle, to discuss it. Near the barn, perhaps." Her question was gentle, but it landed like a stone, and Lyle's face paled, just to talk. He said quickly, "I left by evening, long before the fire. You've got my pen, I know, but I told you, I lost it weeks ago." His voice was defensive, and Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, the way his hands fidgeted with a paperweight. Harrow grunted, closing the ledger. "We'll take this for now, Lyle. Don't leave town." He turned to Miss Marple, his voice low. "You were right about the policy, miss. Looks like Giles was onto something. Fraud's a motive, sure enough." As they left the office, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the Barnes clues of kerosene, the cloth, the boot prints. Lyle's ledger confirmed his motive, but the cloth suggested Ellen, and the prints pointed to Bradley or Jed. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a forged will had led to a confrontation, not murder, but the greed had been the same. Lyle's fraud was clear, but had he killed to protect it, or was another hand at work? Back in her cottage, she opened her notebook. Adding, "Ledger policy inflated," Giles questioned. Lyle at farm, evening, 2 days prior. The truth was closer, but the pattern was still incomplete. She would need to revisit the suspect's reactions, perhaps press Ellen or Jed further. For now, she sipped her tea, the fire's glow steady, as she wove the policy's secret into her tapestry of truth. Chapter 11. The Final Thread. The soft glow of a single lamp illuminated Miss Jane Marple's parlour as she sat by her fireside, the quiet of St. Mary Mead wrapping her cottage like a shawl. Her knitting lay idle on the table, its blue wool untouched, for her mind was too occupied with the threads of the Giles murder to spare a thought for stitches. The clues she had gathered, the kerosene-stained glass, Lyle's pen, the checkered cloth, Bradley's boot prints, Jet's burn, and now the damning ledger had woven a pattern that was nearly complete. Yet one final thread eluded her, a connection. That would tie the motive, the means, and the murderer together. She sipped her tea, her eyes fixed on the fire's dance, and let her thoughts unravel the case with the patience of a seamstress mending a tear. The ledger had been the turning point, confirming Vernon Lyle's fraud. Giles' suspicion of the inflated policy, noted in Lyle's own hand, suggested a confrontation that could have led to murder. The pen, found in the ashes, placed Lyle at the barn, despite his denials. But the cloth, with its blue checks, matching. Ellen's apron and the boot prints, possibly Bradley's, muddied the picture. Jed's burn and his fierce loyalty to Ellen added another layer, one of devotion that might have turned dark. Miss Marple knew that murders, like village scandals, often hid behind simple facades, and she sensed the truth was close, waiting for a final tug to reveal it. She opened her notebook, its pages a tapestry of her observations, and reviewed the clues. The kerosene and glass shard confirmed arson, a deliberate act to destroy evidence or claim insurance. Lyle's pen tied him to the scene, but its discovery felt too convenient, as if placed to be found. The cloth implicated Ellen, yet its placement in the crevice suggested a deliberate attempt to shift blame. Bradley's temper and boot prints made him a suspect, but his feud seemed too blunt for such a calculated crime. Jed's burn and his purchase of lamp oil were suspicious, but his protectiveness toward Ellen suggested he acted for her, not against Giles. Miss Marple leaned back, her mind drifting to a long-ago case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen letter had been planted to mislead. The cloth, she thought, was a similar misdirection, but by whom? Lyle, to frame Ellen, or Ellen herself, to deflect suspicion. The ledger pointed to Lyle's greed, but the murder required a colder hand, one that struck Giles before the fire consumed him. She recalled Harrow's report, mentioned in passing, that Giles had been struck on the head, a detail not yet public. The fire was a cover, not the cause, a classic trick to hide a killing. Her thoughts turned to the suspect's reactions at the vicarage. Lyle's panic at the mention of the pen had been palpable, his charm crumbling under pressure. Elam's fear when the cloth was mentioned suggested knowledge, if not guilt. Jet's accusation of Lyle, coupled with his protectiveness, hinted at a deeper involvement, perhaps to shield Ellen. Bradley's defiance was genuine, but his threats against Giles were too public to be the act of a careful murderer. Miss Marple's mind circled back to Lyle, whose fraud was the strongest motive. Yet the cloth and print suggested another hand or a clever ruse. She rose, her movements slow but purposeful, and fetched the insurance pamphlet from her earlier library visit. The clause on fraud, voiding payouts, was clear. If Giles had exposed Lyle's scheme, the agent stood to lose not just money but his reputation. A desperate man, she knew, could turn to desperate acts. Lyle's visit to the barn, noted by Jed, and confirmed by the ledger, placed him there hours before the fire. Had he lured Giles to discuss the policy, only to strike him down when challenged? The fire, then, would be a cover, the kerosene and glass its tools. But the cloth troubled her. Ellen's apron was too personal, too specific to be accidental. Miss Marple recalled Ellen's trembling hands, her fierce defense of Jed. Was she protecting him or herself? Jed's burn and oil purchase suggested. He could have set the fire, perhaps at Ellen's behest, but his devotion seemed to stop short of murder. Bradley's boot prints, meanwhile, could be explained by his presence near the barn, as Ellen had seen him at dusk. The pieces fit, but not perfectly, until Miss Marple considered a simpler truth. Lyle, the master of appearances, could have planted the cloth to implicate Ellen. Knowing her closeness to Jed would draw suspicion. She closed her notebook, her mind clear. Lyle had the motor fraud exposed. He had the opportunity, visiting the barn that evening. The pen was his mistake, the cloth his misdirection. Giles' death was no impulse. It was a calculated act to silence a threat, the fire, a veil to hide it. Bradley's feud, Jet's loyalty, and Ellen's grief were distractions, their guilt limited to anger and secrets. Miss Marple knew she must act before Lyle's charm smoothed over his cracks. She telephoned Constable Harrow, her voice calm but firm. "Constable, I've been thinking about that ledger and the pen. I believe Mr. Lyle has more to answer for. Could we meet at the village hall tomorrow? I'd like to discuss it with all the suspects present." Harrow, accustomed to her insights, agreed, his tone a mix of skepticism and trust as she hung up. Miss Marple returned to her chair, the fire's glow steady. The final thread was in place, and tomorrow she would pull it, revealing the pattern of murder hidden in the ashes. For now, she sipped her tea, her thoughts as precise as her knitting, ready to lay bare the truth in the light of day. Chapter 12. The revelation. The village hall of St. Mary Mead stood at the heart of the community, its stone walls weathered by decades of gatherings, fates, meetings, and now a reckoning. Miss Jane Marple had chosen this neutral ground for the final act of her investigation, a gathering of the suspects to lay bare the truth of Farmer Giles' murder. The hall was modest, with rows of wooden chairs and a small platform at one end, its windows letting in the pale light of a late October afternoon. A table held a simple tea urn, a nod to propriety, but the air was thick with tension, not hospitality. Miss Marple sat near the platform, her knitting bag at her side, her gentle demeanour a mask for the sharp resolve within. She had woven the threads of the case Lyle's pen, the kerosene shard, the checkered cloth, Bradley's boot prints, Jet's burn, and the damning ledger into a pattern that pointed to one man, and she was ready to reveal it. Constable Harrow stood by the door, his broad frame a reassuring presence, his notebook tucked under his arm. The suspects arrived, their faces a gallery of unease. Tom Bradley slouched in, his scowl deeper than ever, his hands thrust into his pockets as if to restrain his temper. Ellen Giles followed, her shawl drawn tightly around her, her eyes red but steady, as if braced for what was to come. Jed Harper entered next, his wiry frame taut, his gaze flickering to Ellen with a protective intensity. Vernon Lyle was last, his polished suit and practiced smile intact, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear as they met Miss Marple's calm stare. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but carrying the weight of authority. "It's a sad business, gathering like this, but Mr. Giles' death demands answers. Constable Harrow has been tireless, but I've been thinking, as old women do, and I believe the truth is clear." She paused, her eyes moving from face to face, noting Bradley's clenched jaw, Ellen's trembling hands, Jet's restless shift, and Lyle's tightening smile. Harrow cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Miss Marple's got a knack for seeing things we miss. Let's hear her out." His tone was gruff but respectful, and the suspects settled into their chairs, their silence heavy with anticipation. Miss Marple folded her hands, her expression serene. "The fire was no accident," she said. "Kerosene and a broken bottle in the ashes prove it was set deliberately. But Mr. Giles was struck down first, killed before the flames took him. The question is why, and by whom?" She let the words linger, her gaze steady. Bradley stirred, his voice rough. "I told you I was mending fences that night. I had no part in it." His eyes darted to Lyle, a spark of suspicion in them. Ellen's voice was low, almost a whisper. "I was asleep. I didn't know until the smoke woke me." Her hands gripped her shawl, and Jed leaned toward her, his face tense. Miss Marple nodded, her tone gentle. "And yet, a scrap of cloth was found, like your apron, Mrs. Giles. Strange, isn't it, to find it in the ashes?" Ellen's face paled, and Yet's hand twitched, as if to reach for her. "It wasn't mine," Ellen said quickly. "I swear it." Her eyes met Miss Marple's, pleading, and Miss Marple noted the fear, but also the truth in her voice. She turned to Lyle, her smile unwavering. "And you, Mr. Lyle, lost a pen in the barn, engraved with your initials. Curious, for a man who claims he was only there once." She reached into her handbag, producing the blackened pen, and held it up, its metal glinting in the light. Lyle's smile faltered, his voice sharp. "I told you, I lost it weeks ago. Anyone could have picked it up." His hands fidgeted, and Miss Marple saw the sweat on his brow, the crack in his charm. She leaned forward, her voice calm but relentless. "The ledger tells a different story, Mr. Lyle. Mr. Giles questioned your policy, found it inflated beyond the barn's worth. He threatened to report you, didn't he? That evening, you went to the barn to discuss it, but he wouldn't back down, so you struck him and set the fire to cover your fraud and your murder." The room fell silent, the only sound the faint creak of chairs. Lyle's face drained of color, his smile gone. "That's absurd," he stammered. "I was in town, at the Red Lion. You've no proof." Miss Marple's eyes held his, unyielding. "Mrs. Price saw your car near the farm that evening, not just days before. Jed saw you inspecting the beams, planning your fire." The pen was your mistake, Mr. Lyle, and the cloth a clumsy attempt to frame Mrs. Giles. You knew her bond with Jed would draw suspicion, didn't you? Her voice was soft, but each word was a needle, piercing his defenses. Jed's voice cut through, fierce. He's lying, Miss Marple. I saw him, skulking by the barn. He's no good. Ellen gripped his arm, her eyes wide with fear. Bradley snorted, his voice bitter. Lyle's the sort to cheat a man and smile about it. Giles deserved better, but I didn't kill him. His defiance was genuine, and Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions of him fading. Lyle stood, his voice rising. This is nonsense. You're an old woman with fancies, Miss Marple. I'm no murderer. But his hands shook, and Harrow stepped forward, his face stern. Sit down, Lyle, Harrow said. We've got the ledger, the pen, and witnesses. You've got some explaining to do. He nodded to Miss Marple, a grudging respect in his eyes. Lyle's shoulders slumped, his charm shattered. All right, he whispered, his voice breaking. Giles was going to ruin me. He found the fraud, said he'd go to the authorities. I went to reason with him, but he wouldn't listen. I hit him, just once, with a shovel. He fell, and I panicked. The fire was to cover it, to make it look accidental. His words tumbled out, a confession born of defeat. Ellen gasped, her hand covering her mouth. Jed's face hardened, his arm around her. Bradley muttered a curse, shaking his head. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting untouched, her eyes calm but triumphant. Harrow cuffed Lyle, his voice steady. You're coming with me, Lyle. We'll sort the rest at the station. He turned to Miss Marple, his tone softer. You've done it again, miss. I don't know how, but you've got a nose for it. Miss Marple smiled, rising with a gentle nod. Just an old woman's fancies, Constable. Thank you for indulging me. She gathered her knitting bag and left the hall, the suspects' voices fading behind her as she walked to her cottage. The evening air cool and clear, Miss Marple felt the weight of the case lift. The truth had been simple, as truths often were. Greed, fear, a moment of violence. Bradley's feud, Jed's loyalty, and Ellen's grief were mere shadows, cast by Lyle's calculated act. She recalled a village scandal, years ago, where a hidden debt had led to betrayal. This was no different, only darker. In her parlour, she settled by the fire, her knitting resumed at last. The blue shawl took shape under her fingers, each stitch a reminder of the pattern she had unravelled. St. Mary Mead was quiet again, its rhythm restored, and Miss Marple sipped her tea, ready for the next knot that life might bring.